Hi, and welcome to another edition of Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry DeSilva. Always good when we can talk some sports here on the program. We've got a gentleman, a diamond in the rough, as I call him, and hopefully his wife agrees with that. He's written a marvelous football book about Hollywood's team, the Los Angeles Rams. And in 2016, after 20 years in St. Louis, the Rams moved back to their longtime home. Makes you wonder if they ever should have left in the first place. Some call their return to Los Angeles a relocation, but it's more than the restoration of a city landmark. Hollywood's team, the book, follows the Rams of the 1950s. A lot of names that you may not know because, again, they were going way back in time. But some other names, plenty of Hall of Famers that our author guest will have stories about. And not to mention his dad, John Hock, was a lineman, I believe, for the Rams back in the 50s. That started his career with the Chicago Cardinals. There's another one you'll have to think about. And we welcome to the show Jim Hock. Jim, welcome to Studio 411. How are you?
Great, Larry. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate being here.
Oh, our pleasure, our pleasure. And just before we continue, the book co-written with Michael Downs, published by Rare Bird Books, say that 3 times, rarebirdbooks.com, Hollywood's team, grit, glamour, and the 1950s LA Rams. Obviously, I usually start off with an author and say, well, what inspired you to write the book? Obviously, the fact that your dad was a big part of the team in the 50s. But just to kind of start off on this note, you were, what, the last of 7 children, if I am correct?
That is correct. I was the runt of the litter. And
you were born in 1969. So really, for you, this is, as we were talking off air one day, I said, you're like a historian. I mean, you had it's almost like a genealogy search. You know, you had to dig and cull resources and interview people for over a long period of time because you weren't even born at this time when your dad was in his heyday.
No, that's right. I mean, my dad retired in 1957, major knee injury, knee surgery, and 12 years later, I came along. My older siblings were alive but babies, and the genesis. My dad had passed away of cancer in 2000 at a memorial service for a big Irish Catholic family. So, of course, there was some beers and alcohol involved at the memorial service. And a lot of his old teammates had come telling stories. And my brother, who's closest to me, 4 years older than me, kind of said, hey, these are great stories. You're a writer. You should write these up. And it really just was a way of kind of connecting with my dad and the history. And I just started having conversations with some of his old teammates and then people around Gifford and Art Donovan at the time. Everyone was gracious with their time, and it was just wonderful. Kind of put those stories together, and it took me figure out the net. Writing a book takes a lot of discipline. Someone with myself, it's time. So I created the book, and just I heard the stories growing up about what it was like to play football in the 1950s, and I'm fascinated by it. So I just tried to highlight in each of the chapters some of those stories and kind of weaving my parents' story in the middle of it as well.
And now, how old were you, do you think, when you realized your dad had been an NFL player? Because by the time you were kind of conscious of football as a young boy, I mean, the NFL had certainly surged ahead by leaps and bounds. And then you're thinking, wow, your dad played this sport?
Yeah, it's funny. When I was a kid, I had one of my best friends to this day. His dad went to Fordham Prep in New York City, which also has the moniker the Rams. Ironically, I went to college at Fordham, but we were in 2nd grade or something like that, and we were in school. And he goes, I heard your dad played for the Rams. My dad did, too. And I was really excited. I was like, oh, he did play professional football with the LA Rams. He said, no, my dad played at Fordham. And so, I mean, realization, it was part of our grown-up existence. We were always going to games. My parents were really good about kind of guys and the lives of my dad's who were coaches at the time. So we'd go in locker room, in school and high school, and going to the Eagles games or Giants games or, traveling up to Boston, wherever they were playing. My dad would like to catch up with his old friends. So for me, at a very young age, kind of realized that people just, doing what they loved. And my dad also said never ask for an autograph because they're just like you and me. They don't need any special treatment. So
yeah, I saw that in the book, and I thought that was quite a good statement for any person. Is that again, we shouldn't be swayed or overly awed by these people, be it politicians, singers, whatever, authors.
Right.
Just they're regular folks. As what's the old saying? They put their pants on the same way as you and I, and that's a good thing. Yeah. Now. Tell me a little bit about and also we can pull up a photo just so the folks can get a little perspective on his dad, John Hock, again of the Los Angeles Rams. Tell me a little bit about your dad's upbringing. He grew up in, what was it, Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so he was born to a steel worker in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1928. And obviously hard hit during the Depression, and my grandfather had lost his job on steel mill, and so my grandfather decided to move out west to California, which back then my dad had no idea what that was. Pulls up to him walking to school one day and says, "Son, I'll see you in a month or so. I'm going to go out to California. Your cousin will bring your mom and your sister out to LA." So they moved from to Los Angeles when my dad was about 9. There's a couple of pictures in the book of that in the insert. But really, it was kind of just to see greater opportunity. And so he grew up in LA, right where near the Coliseum, where USC is, right. A small little house, and my mother grew up in that same neighborhood. Eventually went to high school and right there went at a school that's no longer there. But then went to Santa Clara University in Northern California and won the Orange Bowl. And he was a senior playing against Bear Bryant and the Kentucky Wildcats at the time. And then he was drafted by the Chicago Cardinals. Played there for about a year, and then was drafted into the Korean War, and did back then NFL play. I went to the service when called, and then he was in 1953. So he was real excited to go back and play for the Rams.
Oh, I'll say, and it's interesting too. Things that we forget, and I had forgotten this, and some things I never even knew at all. But again, most people don't realize that the Rams really had their beginnings were as the Cleveland Browns, and that was of a they weren't in the NFL, correct, at that time? That was like, was it the AF or AA something?
Yeah, actually the Rams and the Rams were separate. So the Rams started with the first professional team in Cleveland. The Browns came a few years later in the old football conference, and the Browns were frankly the better team and got more attention. And then in the late 1940s, the owner at the time, Dan Reeves, who was a supermarket chain owner, decided to move west to California just for kind of, with the post-war boom, saw what was happening, with folks moving to the west of the Mississippi. And so he moved them out and had to get a special agreement to move to the LA Coliseum, and the rest was history. So they played there for decades. But they were the first team to move west of the Mississippi in the 1940s. And of course, we saw the New York Giants become the San Francisco Giants and other teams eventually out there as well.
I assume it probably falls on Mr. Reeves, who at that time was the owner. But you have to wonder, I mean, kind of the parallels are interesting. Both, your dad's parents, as well as then, an owner like Reeves, both taking chances. Obviously, one, I don't know which would be a bigger risk. They both were kind of big. One uprooting one's family and going into the unknown, not knowing whether you're going to get a well-paying job. The other one, uprooting a team, and I'm sure the league wasn't too happy about it, and then moving all that way. Because again, now teams, if they wanted to play them, they had to travel an awful long way to go play the team in LA. And it wasn't like today where you can go to LA, next week Oakland, next week Seattle. That was it. It was, okay, get on a train or a plane or however they did it and get back to the, east of the Mississippi.
Exactly. The question, Larry, because part of the deal that allowed the Rams to move to LA was Dan Reeves had to commit to the NFL commissioner at the time and the other owners that he would reimburse them for their trips out west, because it oftentimes was a train which took a couple days from, if you're in Chicago or longer Philly or New York. And so that was part of the deal was, okay, you can move out here. This is an experiment, but you have to underwrite to be able, because it's a heck of a long way to go.
Oh, absolutely. Jim Hock, author of the book Hollywood's Team, Grit, Glamour, and the 1950s Los Angeles Rams, joining us here for the hour on Studio 411. The website for more information, rarebirdbooks.com. Jim Hock, author, along with Michael Downs, co-authoring the book. The interesting thing, and I wrote this note down, and then I thought to myself as I'm looking at it now, made me think of some things going on in our world today, and I'll read it the way I wrote it. Dreamers, immigrants, war vets flocked to California during the first half of the 20th century. I said, gee, dreamers. I guess, dreamers were okay back in those days. I'm not so sure how they're viewed today, but that's for another show. How did your dad view the tremendous population boom during his lifetime? I mean, when he went out there, he was how old again when he moved to California?
Yeah, he was 9 when he moved to California, and saw just tremendous. He was basically doubling in size from the 30s to the 40s to the 50s. Each year it was double the size. So, I remember stories growing up of just constant churn of hearing my parents talk about, oh, that building was on the Sloss, whatever the dimension was, and then it was gone, and something new and different. And kind of a theme in the book is kind of the explosion in population, the dynamism that was going on in California. That's kind of part of the Rams franchise as well, because they were constantly kind of reinventing themselves and being innovative, etc. My mom talks about stories of growing up in the Santa Monica Freeway, which is, you can't imagine it today because it's about 10 lanes wide, but it was effectively a dirt 40s when she was a kid.
A lot of changes. A lot of changes.
And, concrete was built.
Yeah, a lot of changes that went on during those years. Your dad, John, was drafted out of college in 1950. You said he went to, when I saw USC, I thought, oh, USC, and I realized University of Santa Clara, so a little further north, I believe, if my geography is correct. Your dad was drafted, so that was a Jesuit school. And just to touch on that a little bit, kind of fill us in, that made quite an impression on your dad, not only from a football standpoint, but more importantly from just kind of a lifestyle standpoint. At least that's the impression I got from reading the book.
It was and kind of the theme of social justice and giving back. Kind of what the Jesuits are the teachers that kept. I explain to my kids the Jesuits like one of you have Carmelites and other different, types of priests. But, he wanted to go to Santa Clara. He really enjoyed it. He liked the football coach at the time, Les Casanova. And, he got full rides to Notre Dame, to USC. He could have gone anywhere in the country. He just liked the vibe of a small school where he could play a bigger part. And, he always had a big fish in a smaller pond and had a really good career there. And obviously we're ranked, I think it was 8th in the nation his senior year when they won the Orange Bowl. And he coached by then Bear Bryant, which I mentioned earlier. But he just had a wonderful, lifelong friends. And actually a number of teammates were drafted as well, believe it or not. Santa Clara doesn't even have today.
Jim Hock joining us via satellite. We're having a little bit of trouble with the connection, so we're going to keep Jim, if we can, there you go. I think it cleared up a little bit. Crazy weather we've been having, but anyway, so Jim, of course, the author of the book Hollywood's Team, published by Rare Bird Books, rarebirdbooks.com for more information, co-authored with Michael Downs. As I started to say earlier, your dad was drafted out of college in 1950. Your dad was drafted by the Chicago Cardinals, and of course a lot of folks would be like, well, Chicago Cardinals, what's that? Well, of course, they later became the St. Louis Cardinals, and now you might know them best as the Arizona Cardinals. So, talk about teams moving a lot. You don't think of that today as we have Jim back on the screen. A lot of movement going on in those early days.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the Cardinals were and the Bears were the teams in Chicago at the time, and the Cardinals were kind of the second team in the city of Chicago. They played in the old Comiskey Park where the White Sox played, and they just couldn't make it in terms of, they had a following, but the Bears were beating them at the box office, if you will, or the ticket office. And so in 1960, they decided to move to St. Louis, again, a growing city. But funny story about the Cardinals was Curly Lambeau, which Lambeau Field in Green Bay is named after. He was the head coach of the Cardinals at the time. I believe he was in his 70s. They gave him a part of the franchise. So for the last couple of years of his career, he coached the Cardinals and was trying to turn them around. And he, back then there wasn't, we're talking over Skype. There was no internet. There was no video, kind of to send film. So the coaches would actually go see it, check out the meet, if you will. And so he, when he drafted, my dad went out to his dorm room in Santa Clara and sat there and kind of talked to him and, checked him out in person. And my dad told this funny story how Curly Lambeau was sitting on his bed and, he was worried about the Jesuits, getting worried because Curly Lambeau was a big smoker at the time and the ashes were falling on my dad's bed. So the entire time he's like, I didn't hear anything he said. I just was worried about getting wrapped on the knuckles.
The place was could be lit up at any moment with Hall of Famer Curly Lambeau. A great story, great story. Your dad was traded to the Rams. I thought this was pretty interesting. Maybe I misread it. He was traded for 2 rookies while he was still in the service. So what's the story? But was your dad that considered that high a prospect, or what was the deal that they would give up 2 rookies for a guy that was tied up in the military for at least a few more months?
Yeah, it was quite common back then to, have NFL players, go and serve, and he was drafted. And the reality is when he was in Korea, he played football in a USO league with a lot of the other NFL players. He was based in Japan mostly. But, the Rams wanted him really badly. They had a new coach, and Sid Gilman, who eventually became one of the top, passing kind of coaches in the NFL. He's in the Hall of Fame now. But, and Hamp Poole was the other coach. And they really wanted my dad badly because they needed some good offensive linemen, and he was a young up-and-coming player.
Your dad is a young boy. This was, all I could think of was something in the countryside. Your dad sold rabbit skins. I mean, and those skins just didn't come off by themselves. And please spare us the details, but it certainly was covered in the book. And I mean, boy, if a guy can skin a rabbit, imagine what he can do on the football field.
Yeah, exactly. He was a tough guy, and back then, a different time. But whatever you could do to make a little bit of money on the side, and that was his deal. He would skin rabbits and sell the pelts, and I guess people actually bought them back then for a decent amount of money.
I guess it was. Were those things in those old movies I would see where the ladies would have them around their neck? I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking of a mink. I'm not sure, but oh my goodness. Oh,
poor man's mink.
Yeah. You write in the book, okay, that in January of '53. Now, your dad had even tried out for the Olympic trials. What was his specialty sport?
Yeah, that's right. He was a pretty well-rounded athlete, unlike his son here, but he was a wrestler as well, and he went to the Olympic trials and was a pretty good wrestler. Funny story as well. He was also kind of recruited back in the early days of what's now the WWE, the Wrestling Federation. He had considered that because you could make some good money, touring around the country doing wrestling tournaments. But yeah, he was invited to the Olympic trials, didn't make it, but he was a really outstanding athlete.
There's a thing in the book that I made a notation of. What was considered your dad's greatest gift, quote, a willingness to take up any load, to tolerate any pain. And given what sounds like his early onset problems with his knees, and we'll call it his legs, even during playing football, I think a lot of times people think that, well, in the early days, you look at the old films, they don't look like they're really touching one another. But I tell you, they also didn't have the helmets and the padding like they do now. And you and I talked a little bit about this off air, was that you wonder why a lot of these folks later on, I mean, your dad, you talk in the book, passed away of cancer, but, a lot of these other gentlemen they were the early forerunners of this whole CTE and concussion syndrome. I mean, I can only imagine what was going on in those days. Rub some dirt on it and get back in the field. And
exactly.
you're running the wrong way. Go this way. I mean, I can only imagine what was going on back then.
Right. Yeah, medical attention was not what it is today. And just an example, when he was in college, which everyone at the time did, but in the late 40s, he was wearing a leather helmet that, he would tell stories about how he could, at the end of practice, just fold it up and put it in his back pocket, the hat. So,
wow.
I mean, they hit in a lot of different ways. In the 50s, head slaps were legal, where you could actually literally just slap somebody in the side of the helmet. We have one of his old helmets, and it's to say it has padding is an overstatement. It's basically a piece of plastic with some string holding your head on, and so yeah, I mean, I know the science of CTE is tragic, but a number of the folks that I talked to as part of this book, eventually had either dementia or Alzheimer's issues, and you can't help but wonder if it's based on some of the way that they were playing, that the lack of kind of support in the uniforms, that type of thing as well.
There was a gentleman that is mentioned in the book briefly. I think he might have missed playing with your dad, played against him, but was at the time that Jim Brown retired. This gentleman by the name of, oh my God, is it Ollie Matson? Do I have the name correct? He was like second all-purpose rushing of all time. This was like when he retired in 1966. And to think he started back in like 1952, 53. Also, I believe he did make the Olympics one year. So he was a multi-talented guy. When he passed, I want to say he passed in like the early 2000s. Again, he was, from what I read, was a classic example of CTE. So here's a guy that played for like probably 14, 15 years. I believe it was 14. And I can only imagine the punishment that he took as a running back, an all-purpose back. And, they said when he died, he basically would do two things, or when he was towards the end of his life, his family would come to see him, and he would wash the car every day, and then at 6:30 at night, he would make chicken. He would fry chicken. And in other words, I guess it never dawned on him that he was doing the same thing every day, because it was almost like he was doing it by rote, because the mind really wasn't there.
Yeah, unfortunately, a number of the folks, from the 50s and 60s and 70s, and we're seeing today as well, had those issues, right? And gosh knows how many times they were hit in the head and it wasn't diagnosed. And, there used to be an expression, you got your bell rung, but that was, people would laugh at it. But that's some serious stuff when you talk about brain trauma.
1953, a big year on many fronts, but we'll cover this point first before we get back to your dad. Pro football was kind of, would you say, a sports afterthought? I mean, college was big, horse racing was big, boxing was big. I would suffice to say that many sports, even track and field perhaps, these sports were bigger than pro football. And, but again, I still say that, Reeves moving the team to Los Angeles probably was one of the best things that they could have done for the league as a whole.
No, exactly. It expanded, nationally the focus of football. But Larry, you ask a great question, because there's a little vignette in the book about it. I went back and looked at Sports Illustrated and just what spreads were like at the time. And baseball would, on average, have a 10-page section on the sport in Sports Illustrated. Pro football was lucky to have one. College football had a couple pages, but it was a new sport. It was still kind of trying to find its way into the American consciousness, and I think, and we kind of talk about it in the book a bit, and the Rams were one of the precursors of the connection between football and television. But it was a natural television sport in the late 1950s and early 60s, and this is where Pete Rozelle was so genius. He saw that combination, and then it took off like a rocket ship.
But even before Rozelle got there, and we'll talk about him a little later with the Rams and then later as commissioner, Reeves and his people early on that he had, the Rams, I believe it was KABC, their games, I know their away games were on TV. And then what was it? Wasn't even at one point, I think the Admiral TV company, they agreed to air the home games, and then you think, wait a minute, the attendance is going to drop because everybody's going to stay home and watch the game. But for every seat that they didn't sell, Admiral, I guess, reimbursed them, almost like that was the fee for airing their spots. And I mean, that added up to a lot of money.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Rams were in the 50s were one of the most populous and popular teams in the NFL. I mean, they were regularly selling out the Coliseum, which back then, 95,000 people was regular people sitting in the not even in the stands. They were sitting in the rows as you walk up to your seats. It was that crowded. But yeah, they were the first team to craft a deal, a television contract, because Dan Reeves and Pete Rozelle, who was there, as you mentioned, became the NFL commissioner in 1960, the board commissioner at age 33. But he was a really dynamic marketer, and they saw the power of television. And that local television contract, other teams clearly paid attention to it and kind of developed their own as well. But the Rams were the first to do that. And you're absolutely right about the reimbursing of seats to make sure you had enough people in the seats. At the same time, you were, having little kids that weren't going to the game watching this sport, which is pretty cool, and developing new fans. So the pipeline of fans.
And you talk about, too, little kids. The team, I read there, too, where a lot of times they were giving seats away, by the boatload again. So they were filling up because, again, this place, the Coliseum, would seat, or still seats, I assume, for college, 90, 100,000 people. So he was going to fill that regardless, just to get people talking, not to mention then when you're on local or regional TV, you're like, wow, look at all these people that are there. I mean, so they really, they were genius. The other thing about, you mentioned the boy wonder Rozelle, the only person I can think even of close to that age that got elevated to anything in recent memory would be like a Theo Epstein when he became GM of the Red Sox and led them to their early. But that's position, while important, is not even on the same level as an NFL commissioner. I mean, he was the boy wonder for sure.
Exactly. But he was a marketer. He was a marketer at the perfect time that the sport needed marketing.
Oh, absolutely.
It's constantly trying to innovate, and obviously then, set a national television contract to the league, which then exploded. And every other sports league now is envious of the NFL's annual television contracts.
Absolutely. Jim Hock joining us for the hour here on Studio 411. The book, Hollywood's Team, Grit, Glamour, and the 1950s Los Angeles Rams, co-authored with Michael Downs, Rare Bird Books. For more information, rarebirdbooks.com. We've got an image when the crew can bring it up of a couple of the quarterbacks that were on the team. Bob Waterfield, who your dad actually didn't play with. Waterfield retired early after the 52 season. But the reason I bring this up is quite a 1-2 combination. Waterfield on the left and Van Brocklin, Norman Van Brocklin, both Hall of Famers. Quite a combination that the Rams had for quite a few years, and then of course Van Brocklin later on his own with some other help. But your dad was given a nickname by Van Brocklin. Tell me about that.
Yeah, he had a few nicknames. Just to back up, I mean, you're talking Norm Van Brocklin and Bob Waterfield, two Hall of Famers, right, in the same backfield that actually rotate plays on and off, and they were both amazing. Bob Waterfield was a really handsome guy, fit very well in Hollywood, but he was also a really quiet, unassuming guy. But he had married Jane Russell, the actress, model, Cross Your Heart Bra.
I was gonna bring a photo of her, and then because the viewer really, a lot of folks may not remember Jane Russell. As a young man, I remember her from she used to do these commercials for lingerie later on, which were quite successful. I'm sure made her a lot of money. But she was a smart businesswoman, and of course, anyone who ever saw the 1943 movie The Outlaw, which was produced by Howard Hughes, would understand what I mean. So she was quite something to look at, and Mr. Waterfield didn't look like he was too unhappy in any pictures I saw. But yet, yes, love. They divorced many years later. But
yeah, exactly. But the nugget of your question is those two quarterbacks were exceptional, and my dad obviously knew Bob Waterfield, even though they didn't play together very well. But he went on to play with Norm Van Brocklin for a number of years, and Van Brocklin had a few different nicknames for my dad. Lantern Jaw was one of them. Hocker was another one. Cotton, because he would kind of foam in his mouth sometimes when he sweat. But he was a really fiery personality, and if you watch any of the old NFL films, he would be cursing out, people left and right. And Art Donovan, who I interviewed for the book, who was, a regular on the Late Show, Jay Leno and others, Johnny Carson, just really funny guy. Tell this story about being a defensive lineman facing Norm Van Brocklin, and they would just be cursing each other the whole time before the play was called, and then they would go out for a beer afterwards and just laugh about it. But two fiery personalities.
There's a great clip of Donovan, who in later years was on once or twice on the old David Letterman NBC show. And again, he was like kind of the Bob Uecker of football, you know what I mean? And like all those guys, I think you're old enough to remember when they had the beer commercials where they had guys like Uecker and Art Donovan, and I don't know about Van Brocklin, but Mike Ditka, I mean, you name it. Anybody, Billy Martin, all these guys that were fiery personalities, and they would stage some great stuff. But Donovan, he was as I said, it reminds me of the Bob Uecker of football, but much more talented, way more talented with the old Baltimore Colts. Here we go again. It's a team that started as the Colts. Most folks our age remember them in Baltimore. One day in the mid-'80s, next thing you know, Bob Irsay decides to load up the van, and next thing you know, they're in Indianapolis. So, stuff happens. But I think football is more stable now. What do you think? I don't think I don't think with all the teams that there are, there's much moving around anymore. I think that they've kind of settled in where they need to be.
Yeah, now that the Rams are back in LA, I think all is right with the world.
Well, I stand corrected. Now the Raiders, have they not started in Las Vegas, or is that coming up in a year or two?
Yeah. In 2020, they will move to Las Vegas.
Yeah.
They will play Oakland until then.
So you see, even there I'm wrong. So strike that comment. So, the moves, I don't even know if Al Davis would, if he was alive, would look at it as a positive, knowing what I've read about Al. He probably would say, "Yeah, good," because he'd like to stick it. He'd like to stick it to Roselle too.
Exactly.
Those two are like, man, we're like oil and vinegar. I'm telling you. Yeah. The NFL of the 50s was definitely not the place to get rich. Give me an idea, if you don't mind me asking, what was your dad's top salary? Any idea in those days?
Yeah, it was roughly about $4,000 a year. My mom was, just to give you kind of a construct of what it was like, my mom was a third grade teacher, in the early days before they had kids. They roughly made the same amount of money. My mom, would, relatively, obviously a little bit less than my dad, but, compared to today, you couldn't even imagine it. It was two middle-income incomes. The NFL was a middle-income job as an offensive lineman. He made the Pro Bowl one year before he got injured, and he got $500 and, thought they hit the lottery. And he had promised my mom a bedroom set. So to this day, which he bought with the money, to this day she still has it. My mom is still alive. She calls it the Pro Bowl set.
Wow, that's amazing. And kudos to your mom that she's still with us. That's terrific. Yeah, that's actually, do we have? If we can bring it up, we have a photo of. Now, your mom, they called her Mickey, right? What was her given name?
Her given name is Bernadette.
Bernadette, yeah.
But she had redhead when she was born, and one of her uncles said, if that's not a Mick, like an Irish person, I've never seen one. So she just became Mick and then Mickey.
We've got a photo of your mom, I'm going to say probably in the late 50s with three of your siblings. You're not even a thought at that point, but yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So and then later on we'll show another. We've got another photo later on of your dad and the whole family. But yeah, I was hoping that there would be more photos. When your dad later on, when he got into various business ventures, did he? I get the impression he didn't like his picture taken much.
Yeah, he didn't. I mean, they didn't. Back then it wasn't the iPhone. You just snapped.
Oh no, those Polaroid cameras were great.
My dad was actually a really shy guy. He didn't, kind of humble guy. He didn't really love to be part of the spotlight. So he was classic offensive lineman, wanted to do the work and not get the attention, but be a part of it.
He's the epitome of the term the gentle giant for sure.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Here's a little statistic. Again, we were talking about salaries, which, again, amazing. In the 50s, $3.90 would get you a reserved seat, and programs would run you a whopping 25 cents. So imagine that. For under $5, all you needed was maybe $6, and you probably could eat like a king and see a ball game, and that must have been something. I have not been to the Coliseum, so obviously that structure is still being used for, I assume, just college at this point.
Actually, the Rams play there today.
Oh, they are playing there. Okay, and so that must be a thrill for you because you've been back at least a couple of times. You kind of look around and say, "Wow, this my dad played here." Kind of the ghosts running around. They had a thing, and when you went to Fordham, there was a term, something the ghosts. I don't know, and the galloping ghosts.
Yeah, exactly. You'll laugh, Larry. We live in Virginia, and I have season tickets to the LA Rams. My wife says it's my midlife crisis. She'll allow it, but I share them with my cousins and my brothers and stuff. So we actually went back to I go to a few games a year, but I took my two sons and my wife to the first game back in the summer of 2016, and there were a lot of tears, and it definitely felt like I was in a place where my dad really loved, and it was very emotional. And I actually met another son of a player who we've become good friends, Joe Schiavelli, actually from Massachusetts, from Springfield, Massachusetts. Chris is in LA, and Chris and I had dinner a few months after that, and I admitted to him. I said, Chris, I teared up during that game when they first came out. And he said, oh my God, so did I. And so we laughed about it. But because his dad passed away as well, had a long distinguished career. And so we all kind of felt, wow, this is really incredible that they're back where they belong.
Absolutely. Another note: in 1953, the NFL had 12 teams. 36 players on a roster. I think it's up to at least 45, maybe more now, and plus coaches. So again, sounded like not much of a medical staff. So you're talking probably under 50 to boot. And again, hey, I guess in those days they felt. Now, in those days there was a lot of. I'm blanking on the term, where players would play defense and offense. Your dad basically just played the one side of the ball, correct? Yeah,
they call it platooning, and some players, a few of them played both sides of the ball. My dad was, exclusively on offense in the pros. In college, he did both offense and defense, but he made his career known as an offensive player. But there were a few folks who, exceptional athletes and took the beating on both sides of the ball.
You talk a little bit in the book about, and it's a topic that always comes up, and I think with good reason. It's important when you're kind of sharing it from a historical standpoint. In 1947, the Rams integrated black players. And of course, this is after they had moved from Cleveland. Two gentlemen that stood out to me, and then I remembered they both were players that played back at UCLA, if I'm not mistaken, with the legendary Jackie Robinson, who a lot of people don't realize played college football as well as ran track. Kenny Washington, and a guy who later became a well-known actor named Woodrow or Woody Strode. Again, ahead of the curve. On the other side of the coin, 1953, the Redskins, under their owner, and I'm blanking on his name right now, didn't integrate a black player until a gentleman that I had an opportunity to talk to many, many years ago, a guy named Bobby Mitchell. 1962, that a team took that. That's as bad as the Red Sox in 1959 with Pumpsie Green. After, so 12, 15 years after the sport is integrated, and these teams, and then they wonder why they weren't any good, because you had outstanding players that they were probably passing by. Here you go again, the Rams ahead of the curve, one of the reasons why they were successful, as were the Cleveland Browns later on, and many other teams that New York Giants, same thing, took advantage of the opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. And Larry, I'm glad you highlighted that, because I think it's foundational to sports in general. When the Rams moved to Los Angeles, you mentioned Kenny Washington and Woody Strode. Dan Reeves had to make a deal with the Coliseum Commission, the LA Coliseum Commission, that said, if you're going to play in this city, California was a little bit more progressive, always has been, but on racial issues definitely, said you need to integrate your team. And so he, took that and said, "Okay, I'll do it." He was a guy who was pushing the limits, but that wasn't an easy thing to do. There were some people that were against it. And you referenced the Washington Redskins. The Redskins, at the time, you mentioned again that there was only 12 teams in the NFL. There were no teams south of Washington D.C. On the East Coast. So there was no Atlanta Falcons, there was no Florida teams. So the Redskins had this really powerful radio network throughout the entire South. And obviously, given the racial dimension, the history there, their owner was deathly afraid of integrating because he felt he would lose half of his fan base. A lot of folks don't know, and I researched this in the book, and I live in the D.C. area, the Redskins fight song, which, one of the stanzas is "Fight for Old D.C." At one point, it used to say "Fight for Old Dixie." So it just gives you a sense of, they were the Southern team at the time. So, 15 years is a lifetime. And my dad would always tell these interesting stories about just what it was like. He didn't see color, and some of his best friends were on the team who were African American, but he would tell stories about going to some of these games down south in the preseason. They would do exhibitions in Alabama and Georgia, and just to kind of test the market. But he said this one striking example was in Birmingham, Alabama, where they get off the plane and it's an open air, step down, and these pink and blue fancy cars pulled up, and the 5 or 6 players, Tank Younger and others, hopped in those cars, and they didn't see him until the game. They weren't even in the same locker room. Just saw him on the field, and that was it. Couldn't stay in the same house, hotel. They had to stay in private homes. And so, my dad in a mid-20s age was just kind of, the light bulb going off saying, this ain't right.
Oh, exactly.
And he kind of knew it in his gut,
Another guy, too, that I omitted, but I had a note here because of an amazing statistic. Your dad played with him, although I think his rookie year, oh, no, I beg your pardon. He was there the year before your dad got out of the service. Another Hall of Famer, Dick Night Train Lane, 14 rookie interceptions, a record that still stands, and it was only in 12 games. And let me interrupt for a second, because I forget, is that until 60 or somewhere in there, the season was 12 games. Then it went to 14, I want to say, what was it, in 78?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
I think it was, yeah. And then in late 80s, early 90s, whatever, then it went to 16. Of course, there's always been the big hoopla about, well, we want to expand to 18, and the concussion advocates and on many other levels too are like, no, we don't want to do 18 games. So, but just imagine, to get back to Night Train Lane, 14 interceptions as a rookie with the Rams in 12 games. That's I don't even know how anyone will ever equal that. So in a 16-game season, you'd have to have like 19 or 20 to even approach that level of excellence.
Yeah, exactly. He was a phenomenal player, had a long career, but the Night Train, my dad would always call him. And the funny thing is, they all had nicknames back then.
that was a marketing tool, I guarantee it.
Hirsch and other things, So
talk about some of the playing injuries and ailments that your dad had. I mean, I ask because, again, you've got a lot of siblings. Obviously, you talked about that you played a little ball yourself, but was that just something that, was it from the rigors of college and then even playing in during the service and then pro ball, or was it just that the Hock family, when it comes to knees and those kind of leg injuries, just maybe that's their Achilles heel, no pun intended?
Yeah. Well, someone who tore their Achilles when I was 35.
Oh, my goodness. There you go. So,
Dad, we tried to make my dad was constantly kind of battling with his knees because they gave him a lot of trouble. And, without, knees and an offensive lineman, you're nothing. Any athlete's nothing. But, he had surgery, and that's what eventually forced him to retire. A lot of his contemporaries and buddies at the time said, if he was able to have healthy knees, he would have played a lot longer. And
no doubt.
Had just made the Pro Bowl the year before. So he was just kind of coming into his prime. So, for me, watching him grow up, and kind of having these balloons as knees, just because, back then the surgeries were much different and much more rudimentary and crude. He really suffered with it.
I was going to say, can we bring up that image? I want to show the image of the Hock family like in 1976. You got the whole brood there. I believe Jim is like the youngest one on the bottom, and there's Papa John, there's Mother Mickey, and the whole crew there. And 1976, so you would have been all of about 7 years old. So.
Right, I was the runt in my little school there. Yeah, the Brady Bunch picture we call it.
There you go, exactly. Yeah, with the wood paneling, if I'm not
exactly.
We all had those.
Right.
Jim Hock joining us for the remaining moments here on Studio 411. The book, Hollywood's Team, Grit, Glamour, and the 1950s LA Rams. So much to get to. I'm just going to throw a few facts, and I want to talk about somebody that was very good friends with your dad. Players in the days your dad played, they had screwed cleats into the soles of their shoes. I mean, I can't even imagine this. Players did not get paid for training camp. Plus, they used to play at the Coliseum that inaugural game that didn't count. It was like a preseason game. Yeah. In front of 80, 90, 100,000 people. They didn't get paid for that. I mean, so, I'm sure your dad came to later look, and he doesn't sound like a person that would look back with a vindictive streak, but just say, you know what? We really got hosed when it came to getting, paid for what we should have gotten, not to mention, equipment, not to mention, medical staff. I mean, a lot of stuff that I think they skimped on during those early years.
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, my dad would marvel at the contracts, later in life that football players would, achieve. I mean, the last year of his life was when the Rams went to the Super Bowl against the Titans, and I remember, walking around the stadium and people asking for his autographs, and my mom whipping out his cards, but just talking to the people about, hey, can you imagine how much money you'd make today? It was a different time, and one of the other innovations that the Rams kind of broke through in the 50s was a precursor of a collective bargaining agreement. They unionized as a team, or tried to unionize the team, and the owner hated it. But it was the precursor for kind of the league-wide union that came just a few years later to kind of, especially with the influx of more television money, kind of sharing it more broadly with players.
Absolutely. One more person I want to mention, too, to make sure we get in. Guy that a lot of people, a couple of friends of mine who were diehard Cowboy fans would say, this is like a guy that is like a legend, Tex Schramm, who later was like the brains behind Tom Landry with the Dallas Cowboys. He started out with the Rams as an assistant to the president, and then later went to CBS Sports, and I guess then later went to the Dallas Stars, I think they were called, before they became the Cowboys. So again, you're talking people like Sid Gilman, who later went on to San Diego. They used to talk about Air Coryell, Don Coryell, that used to just have an offense where it was just bombs all the time, deep passes. I mean, Sid Gilman his offense was incredible, but for some reason after that first year in '55, didn't quite click with the Rams after that. I'm not sure why.
That's right. He was a fiery personality, Sid Gilman. He was really innovative. He was one of the first coaches to use, instead of game film, for example, but the modern passing tree, which eventually, Don Coryell, you mentioned, was one of his proteges. They're still using in the NFL today, a lot of the concepts that he developed. But he was a really prickly personality. And my dad liked him and respected him, but he was also just a guy who was, he complained about him a lot in that approach, kind of screaming and hollering and kind of inconsistent. So, he had eventually a run-in with Dan Reeves and was kind of run out of town in the Rams and went on to the Chargers and other places, for great success. I mean, he, was eventually an NFL Hall of Famer himself.
Would the offense or the moniker that was given to like guys like Bill Walsh and his proteges that came later, they used to call it with the 49ers, the West Coast offense. Was that really a forerunner of Gilman, or was that really a different type of offense as you know it than what later became the West Coast offense with the Rams?
Yeah, there's kind of two trees. The West Coast offense is kind of a philosophy of shorter passes and a lot of movement. You see both, most teams use kind of, the West Coast style. But the Gilman tree, if you will, and I'll use that euphemism, is the more longer passes, the longer deep ends, which you see most NFL teams use today. But for a long time in the 60s and 70s, there were kind of two different kind of philosophies when it came to kind of how you threw the ball. And so there's that Bill Walsh kind of tree, which is the West Coast offense. And then you had Sid Gilman, and you mentioned Don Coryell, but, even, down to Joe Gibbs and others came from that kind of longer passing game. Tree, Norv Turner, etc. So you see both elements in most teams' offenses today, but they were definitely distinct based on the different coaching back then.
One gentleman that I want to bring up, we have an image of him too. Andy Robustelli was a teammate of John Hock's, Jim's dad, played with the Rams, and then a lot of people forget this, and then got traded as a on the decline 30-year-old, got traded to the New York Giants, and then went on that year to help the Giants win the NFL championship. We've got a shot. There's a shot of Andy Robustelli right there. Legendary Connecticut sports figure, played with the Giants through 1964. The Giants went to several other NFL championships. Didn't win another one after the one in '56, but a stellar defensive guy. Was well known in the Connecticut area, ran a successful travel business, and also worked for the Giants for many years as a consultant. Wherever he could lend a hand, always kept his hand in football. I bring it up because, again, he was a big influence and a good friend of your dad's. Share, in the minute or two we have left, share a couple of anecdotes. You came to Connecticut as a result of that.
Yeah, so Andy Robustelli was a dear friend of my father's. He was a guy in 1951, born and raised in Stamford, Connecticut, and then died in Stamford. Was Connecticut through and through. And so he, was a terrific guy. 19th round draft pick, was, out of a tiny little Arnold college nobody had ever heard of, and just had this stellar career. But my dad and he were super close. I interviewed Andy for the book. He was terrific. Eventually, became a success in business, but also you mentioned he was the general manager of the Giants for a few years. And when we moved to the East Coast from Los Angeles in the 70s, my dad and he, just saw each other a lot and really had great respect and affection for one another, and good buddies, had been through the trenches, but just a stellar guy.
Jim Hock, author, master of many things. We're definitely going to have Jim back on. Great conversationalist, talking about this marvelous book that he co-authored with Michael Downs. Hollywood's Team, Grit, Glamour, and the 1950s Los Angeles Rams, published by Rare Bird Books. For more information, rarebirdbooks.com. And we will leave this episode with a credo that your dad had, which was, quote, "Do things quietly." And we thank you for joining us, and we send our best to your mom, and we thank your dad and the marvelous playing days that he had. We hope to have you back on again.
Larry, thanks so much. It was a pleasure. Really enjoyed it.
Take care. Hang in there with us. We'll see you next time on Studio 411. Take care.